Today I am delighted to be talking to the Australia Institute's 2024 Writer-in-Residence, Joëlle Gergis, about her latest quarterly essay titled Highway to Hell.
Thanks, Polly. It's great to be here.
The title of your essay is Highway to Hell. I'm assuming it's not a reference to AC/DC, but you might surprise us. Can you tell us where this title came from?
Well, I've got to confess it actually wasn't my title. I gave an early draft of this essay to Richard Dennis to take a read of it. And in there, I actually quote Antonio Guterres, where he says, we're on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. And so basically the essay is really a deep dive into what that actually means. It's a scientific reality check on where we are when it stands.
As your essay references, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, says we're on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. He also said in that same speech that climate is the defining issue of our age, and it's unacceptable for governments to put climate change on the back burner. Does your essay explain why it's unacceptable for governments to put climate change on the back burner?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of this essay as a scientific reality check in terms of where we are right now. 2023 was the world's hottest year on record, and we smashed so many records that a lot of people in the climate science community are starting to wonder whether or not we're actually seeing precursors to abrupt climate change. So that's a really serious and significant thing to be grappling with. And at the same time, we're seeing not only the Australian government, but governments around the world continuing to support the production and use of fossil fuels. So the IPCC says that around 60% of oil and gas reserves need to remain unextracted. And when it comes to coal, 90% needs to remain in the ground if we're going to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So we're so far off track right now. It was actually confronting to work on this essay to just see just how far away we are from the political rhetoric in terms of the scientific reality we're facing.
I don't think people appreciate what we're up against and how vulnerable we are here in Australia. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually talk a little bit about that in the essay where I look at some polling where the average person doesn't really fully appreciate just how serious the threat of climate change actually is. Australia is one of the most vulnerable nations in the world when it comes to climate change. Around about three quarters of Australia is either classified as arid or semi-arid. So about half of the country receives less than 300 millimetres of rainfall per year. So you can think of Australia as just a very hot and dry continent, but we're also the flattest continent on the earth as well. So we're very exposed to increases of sea level. So when we think about sea level rise, a rule of thumb is that for every 1 metre of sea level rise that we get, you see about 100 metres of the shoreline receding. So that's the loss of, sandy shorelines and beaches and things like that. So that's really significant as well for a lot of people who love the outdoors and also just most of our coastal infrastructure. We're very dry, we're very flat, we're exposed to extreme heat, and that leaves us really vulnerable to the threats of climate change.
So I'm always told that people don't like hearing bad news stories and that everyone needs hope and we need to give people stories of optimism and hope when it comes to climate. I don't actually think that's true. I think fear is a far bigger motivator in our lives. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother getting vaccinations or insurance. I think that the issue is not bad news per se. I think when it comes to climate change, that none of us know what to do because governments are actively blocking the solutions or making them seem so much bigger and harder than they are. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I do actually. And I think it's actually pretty heartbreaking because if you actually look at the literature, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the CSIRO and the International Energy Agency all say that we could actually reduce emissions between 50 and 80% by 2030 with existing technology. So when I came across that, I realised that all the solutions that we need already exist today. And I think that's the thing that really is motivating me to write the essay, to think about talking about climate change, because the solutions are there, but the political will isn't. But the longer that we leave, I often like to think about climate change in the context of also, the analogy of a medical condition. So the longer that you ignore or delay treatment of a medical condition, the worse and worse and worse it gets. But the thing is that if you leave it too long, then you can lock in irreversible and irreversible change, if you like. And I guess that's what the climate science community is really worried about. Often we hear about these false solutions like carbon capture and storage, which is basically used to justify the continued expansion of fossil fuel projects right now. But when you look at the numbers, around about 80% of all of the CCS projects over the last 30 years have failed. And if you add up all of its capacity in terms of its ability to reduce emissions, we're talking about 0.1%. So 1/10 of 1% of total global emissions are absorbed by carbon capture and storage as it stands today. And even if all of the CCS projects that are currently on the books worldwide, we're still only looking at 1% of total global emissions. Now, that's a very risky gamble in terms of destabilising the Earth's climate. And it's the sort of thing that I think the average person isn't probably aware of, but should be aware of, because there are very fateful decisions that are being made right now. And that's why I personally think the next federal election is absolutely critical in our nation's history.
There's so much inertia and obfuscation by government that this does feel like an impossible task, but you list a number of policy ideas that could be implemented very quickly. We've seen that government can act quickly when it wants to. Look at the COVID response. We went out and bought some submarines over the course of a couple of days. Governments can act very quickly when they want to, and you list some of these policy solutions.
That's one of the most frustrating things as a climate scientist, because the technology we need to reduce emissions by between 50 and 80% already exists right now. So the very first thing I would suggest is that we need to vote for leaders that have a sense of integrity around climate leadership and what it is to enact climate policies that are really going to do the heavy lifting. So really the first thing that governments could do if they really wanted to is to put a price on carbon. So right now, heavy industry is basically pouring carbon into the atmosphere for free.
I think if companies realised that they had to pay for the damage that they're causing, they would stop causing it quite quickly.
That's right. I mean, I think it's as simple as, I think we talked about it previously, which is just the concept of polluter pays. And right now, we're still pouring carbon into the atmosphere for free. And that's got to stop, because, as I said, there are now components of the Earth system that are starting to destabilise and resulting in really extreme conditions all over the world. So that has to stop. We also need to set a firm end date for the expansion and the use of fossil fuels. So this can't go on, and already has gone on for too long. And I guess we're in the situation we're in because it's basically colossal government failure to enact proper climate policy.
What about fossil fuel subsidies? So collectively, Australian governments give $14 billion. Well, in the last financial year, they gave $14 billion. That seems like something that you would not do if you...
That's right. And according to the International Monetary Fund, in 2022, $7 trillion were poured into fossil fuel subsidies worldwide. So it's not just Australia here. It is a global problem. I refer to it in my essay as an intergenerational crime against humanity, actually, because I think it's, once we destabilise the Earth's climate, that's with us for tens of thousands of years. We just can't undo that. So I guess from my perspective, it's hoping that people will read this essay and think about what it is that they can do to help shift the social licence for the continued exploitation of fossil fuels, particularly in this country, and putting pressure on our government to also be a global leader. They could actually choose to take an ethical stance and decide to actually start to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. And they will argue that we are, but if you look at the Labor government's future gas strategy, there are plans to increase gas production all the way out to 2050 and even beyond. And that is completely inconsistent with what the science says that we need to do. So, I mean, what more can you say, really? I mean, it's pretty obvious when you start looking at it, but we always have a really, really long way to go in terms of the average person really understanding that this is a very serious problem that requires all of us to stop standing on the sidelines and realise that the very stability of the Earth's climate and our ability to live here in a country like Australia is at stake. So we've got to step up.
For once, it's a good news story that Australia is the world's third largest fossil fuel exporter, because that means when we do something here, that has a global impact. So if we actually did put an end date for the last coal mine, if we did stop subsidising fossil fuel expansion, because that we're planning to do that into the future as well, if we did stop approving new gas and coal projects, that would have a significant impact on global supply of fossil fuels. So we're small in some ways, but we're actually very significant in others.
That's such a great point, and it's one that I think that's really where climate leadership, the potential for climate leadership really lies in that space right now. We need to really understand that what we do really matters in this country, and there will be ripples throughout the world. And there's only one chance to get this right. And I always say that the 2020s, we're going to look back at this decade as the make or break in terms of whether or not we end up destabilising the Earth's ice sheets and unleashing a cascade of irreversible climate change. And I'm still holding out some hope that we'll wake up and try and reel this in. The IPCC reports basically outline everything we need to do to get this under control. So it basically comes down to political will. I mean, political recognition of the problem of climate change started 30 years ago. So we've known about this problem for a really long time, but the key messages of the scientific community have been ignored for decades. And now we're at the point where, for instance, in the process of writing this essay, the world's fourth mass coral bleaching event started to unfold. And it was just another sign for me that every single day our climate is changing. And 80% of the Great Barrier Reef bleached is really significant. During the last El Nino event, which was in 2016, 2017, about 50% of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef died off. So we've had mass bleachings again in 2020, 2022, and now 2024. So how much is permanently going to die off is still unknown or undisclosed actually by the government in terms of just how bad the damage has been. But I guess what I'm trying to say with that is that the impacts of climate change are with us now. They're escalating. And I think 2023 was a wake-up call for the climate science community, because there's just a lot of unpredictability in the climate, and the way that the climate has been behaving is becoming more and more erratic, more non-linear, and harder to really predict. It's really the age of consequences is something I talk about in my essay, is that there's really nowhere to hide anymore. I think the impacts are escalating. We have more than enough scientific and technical know-how to do this. It's really the political will, and it's also people, everyday ordinary Australians, just really caring about the future of our country, because sometimes I know it's a difficult thing to think about, but the decisions that are being made today are fateful, and it really will determine the path that we take and which trajectory we go down. Because with the IPCC different scenarios, we know that we can avert the worst aspects of climate change if we actually really rein in emissions. And so we're not talking about the false solutions of carbon capture and storage or dodgy carbon credits and things like that. We're talking about really shutting down the fossil fuel industry, restoring ecosystems, and starting to think about ways to draw down the excess carbon in the atmosphere. It's a big job, but there's many, many things we can do today. So the first thing would be to stop subsidising fossil fuels, ban them. That'd be great too. And then rapidly invest in renewable energy technology, so the transmission and the rollout can be a lot more smooth than it has been. Because, right now in a country like Australia, we're the sunniest continent on the planet, yet we only get 15% of our electricity from solar. And it really shouldn't be that way. It really shouldn't. So there are huge economic opportunities here. We have all the know-how. It's just a matter of doing it.
Do you think Australians are going to be going to the polls? Or do you think the world, judging whether Australia should be hosting a UN climate conference, would look at how things have played out over the last couple of years in Australia and think, yep, more of this, this is what I'm going to vote for?
Yeah, look, this is, as I say, it's a fateful moment in Australia's history. What we do really matters. It matters, as you said before, because we're the third largest fossil fuel exporter. We only have one chance to get this right. So if we blow it, then we blow it not just for us as Australians, but we blow it for our neighbours in the Pacific who are particularly hard hit. And again, I write about that in my essay. There's just so many things I could say, But it is, that's the reason why I'm here. I'm actually taking time away from my scientific research career to write this essay because I want to share all the knowledge I have access to at my fingertips as far and wide as possible, because I know people find IPCC reports really hard to read. Science can be really dense. I've also learned that policy documents can be really, really dense and hard to navigate. So I've just devoted all of my attention into really getting to the bottom of this. And really, I came back up with realizing that it's a lot simpler. It is difficult, but it's also really simple. The solutions are simple. The political will is the difficult thing. So I guess we need to stop and think not that climate change isn't just a scientific issue. It's the great moral challenge of our time. And if we think about it like that, I think it helps shift the conversation, because I know people don't like to talk about climate change sometimes because it's really overwhelming and it's really technical and it's hard. But if we don't, then the decisions that are being made right now about the future of our country will not have any of our input. And it's important that we do engage in the political process, because I really believe that the time for standing on the sidelines has passed. We're in the age of consequences, and what we do every single day matters. And so that's the reason why I'm here. It's the reason why you're here. That's the reason why people are listening, because that's what we need to do. And the good news is that, you know, people really care about this. There is a momentum building and there is a big social movement happening all over the world, and we're just a part of it. But we have to keep pushing and pushing hard, because the future of our world really hangs in the balance.
Well, thank you so much, Joelle, for all your work, for bringing all your work to us so we don't have to do it, and for, I suppose, being on the front line of very confronting and probably fair to say traumatizing information, and writing it up so beautifully and concisely for us so we don't have to wade through it all. Joelle's quarterly essay is called Highway to Hell, and it's available in bookshops or online.
Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.